and who has joined us for this discussion. So I'm just going to do a verbal check of all board members so everyone will know who is here. And then we will move to the first agenda item. So Board Member Cummins.
Here.
And Board Member Haynes.
Hello, Chair Lear. I'm here.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
And Board Member Laurie Ann Thorpe.
I'm here.
Good. And Cindy Davis, Board Member.
Hello, thank you.
Thanks, Cindy. Okay, unless anyone has any opening remarks or comments, we will move right to the first agenda item, which is item 3.1, and it is the Utah State University Authorizing and Remediation Process follow-up that we requested last month. So with that, Angie, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our guests.
Sure, be happy to. And just as a reminder, last month, you reviewed the authorizing processes, including the remediation process for Utah State University. And we have with us both on the WebEx link, David Forbush and Parker Fossen from the School of the Future, who was working with the Utah State University Board of Trustees as staff to the authorizer. So they have come back with some additional information as well as an updated version of their remediation plan, which was also included as backup yesterday on the full board agenda item as well. So if you'd like, we could turn the time over to David and Parker to discuss any updates they made, and then I know they are happy to make or answer any questions that you might have. We also have Danny Davis, who is with us and worked with both Dr. Fossen and Mr. Forbush. I'm not sure if you're a doctor or not, so I'll assume you are, since you work for an institution, higher ed. Dr. Forbush, see if Danny has anything he'd like to add as he worked with them to get this documentation before you today.
So let's go right to then Dr. Fossen and Forbush.
Thank you, Chair Lear, and thank you, USBE members, board members, and also for the USBE staff for the great feedback we received last month. We've tried to make adjustments to processes for remediation in accordance with your feedback, and I'll turn the time over to Dr. Forbush to walk you through some of those modifications.
Thanks. Go on. Carry on.
Dave, turn your mic on.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you. So yes, thank you. And what we've done is made some adjustments. I think you can see them in yellow. If you scroll down the document that you're showing on the screen, I'll talk you through them. And there really are three prongs to the process that respond to the issue that was raised in the last meeting. And that largely revolved around whether there was a potential for conflict of interest. So the first part of the process in terms of our accountability plan, as you know, we're using a multi-tiered system of support. And the purpose of using a multi-tiered system of support is to be responsive, but also to be proactive in addressing needs before they become systematically entrenched in an organization, in this case, charter schools. And so the first part of our effort to respond to that is to ensure that there's choice. So if you read down through our processes, what we propose and are clarifying today is that if a school required, based on their locked score, Tier 2 or Tier 3 supports to continue moving along effectively in terms of their school mission in that measure, then they would have an opportunity to make a choice of an outside party to assist them in getting the kinds of support that they need to come back into a system of health and move their school forward. And so, as indicated last time, they can choose us to help them on a contract outside of the process. They can choose others to help them other institutions and organizations to help them in returning to that state of health and moving back to a tier 1 level. So that's the first piece of that, is that there is choice, and they're not being in any way forced to work with us. The second part of that is that we've attempted to respond to, and I believe we have done in yellow, is to indicate that using the lock tool, which will be the tool used to determine if they need tier 2 or tier 3, if they require those services and we score them as needing that service, then what we're proposing is an interscoring reliability process that we would have a secondary body that's not affiliated with USU, but has been trained and has experience in evaluating school systems, that would use the same process we walk through to go down through the tool and score the school again, and to see if we at least have 90% agreement across the myriad of scores within that tool to ensure that there's a level of agreement. There's high level of agreement. The assumption then at that point is the measure and the method is not a subjective one. It's operationalized, and it's and valid, sufficiently valid and reliable enough that 2 independent groups can get the same outcome, and therefore placement on the tier 2 or tier 3 services would be regarded as appropriate. And what that does within the concern is that it lets those schools know, but also internal to our system, that we have a system that's not an arbitrary one, a subjective one, and that it has a level of agreement in placing schools in those levels of support. So that takes out some of the concern that if the concern was, well, is USU going to just place them on tier 2 or 3, therefore they trigger these other kinds of services that they can to provide an unfair benefit to USU. So that's the second part of all of this, and we're proposing that. And I think the final thing I want to say, and then actually look at the language and then we'll hear from you all, is the recognition that as you read our process, we're absolutely in this for student learning results. We've indicated very clearly that our focus is on designing into our system from inception schools that can produce those kinds of results, and designing out the kinds of systems level elements that would produce poorer results. We recognize that within that multi-tiered system of support, if schools, a larger proportion of our schools are requiring tier 2 or tier 3 services, then we would regard that as a problem in our system, and would be working to find out what do we have to do to change our authorizing support to tier 1 so that fewer of our schools go into tier 2 or tier 3 services. So as indicated in the document, that we would always be looking at data and process and making adjustments so that we have systems that are designed to, by and large, the majority of them would stay out of tier 2 and tier 3 services, not staying out of them as if they're a punishment. They're not. They're a support to schools. But again, the tier 1 should be sufficiently strong, if well designed, that the majority of schools could be functioning well, and those additional supports. So with that, I'll conclude, and the language is on the screen, and so that's some of the clarification that we've offered. Just to remind everyone, we indicated last time that to be an authorizer, Angie Stallings mentioned last time that we don't have a line item to actually do that work, that within code there's a procedure by which we can charge a percentage to provide that service, but that service can't be unlimited in terms of its scope, in terms of the things that could be done, and hence if a school was in tier 2 or tier 3, if they wanted us to do that supportive work at tier 2 or tier 3, versus someone else, then there would be a different fee for that.
Thank you. Anything else? Dr. Fossen, do you have anything else to add?
No, I think David has explained that in response to the feedback we received last month.
Thank you. Board members, do you have any questions or concerns of these gentlemen? I'm looking for any raised hands.
Board Member Cummins has her hand raised.
I didn't get up there. Thank you very much. Go ahead. Board Member Cummins.
Yeah, thank you for looking at this. I really do like the concept of the 3 tiers of supports. Just one, it might be kind of a ticky-tacky question, but on tier 2, the way it's written is different than tier 1 or tier 3. You talk about services given rather than just stating the service. And especially in an area where they're being contracted for that and they have the opportunity to contract out, would it be better just to name what is required, what you're asking, instead of almost sounding like we're offering this as we're giving this during tier 2? Does that make sense? Because you don't use the word given, will be given in any of the other 2-tier language. And I just, in my head, it sounds like it's a gift, something that's being given, rather than just stating additional on-site visits are required, comprehensive reviews in these years are required, facilitation reports, these are required, rather than using the word given.
I think that your suggestion there is a good one, and it's much aligned with what we're indicating. I don't think that we're, as you've indicated, it's a requirement at that point, and so we can make that adjustment. I think that's much clearer in terms of what will happen. So it's a requirement as opposed to actually offering something that they could turn away.
Thanks. Further, Brittany, do you have further thoughts?
No, thank you.
Okay. Board Member Davis.
Thank you, Chair. I have a question, a comment, and then another question. So I'd like to proceed in that order, if that's okay with you, Chair.
Just keep going. Right.
Okay. My question is, I do like this inter-scoring reliability. Can you tell me what the estimated cost is of having that done and who is going to pay the outside party?
Yeah, that would be a service that we would be offering through CSF as part of our authorizing processes. I haven't actually figured out to that in terms of budget, but because it is part of our process, the determination as to whether the school's going to be on a tier 2, receive tier 2 or tier 3 supports, that explanation would actually be, cost would be the authorizing cost that we would not authorized, be offered as part of our authorized.
So you would pay for that cost?
Well,
okay. And I'm going to ask that we mute our mics when Dr. Forbush is speaking, because he's a little bit hard to speak, everyone. I mean, to hear.
And Board Member Davis, it sounds like it might actually be your system, but I'm not sure.
Is it mine? Are you hearing him? No feedback at all?
Not a ton. He's kind of low. He's harder to hear than most, but I can still hear him. But for some reason, when your mic is on, there was a lot of, but it sounds good right now, actually. So maybe it wasn't you, because it seems to have corrected.
Okay.
Go ahead, Dr. Forbush. Maybe just get really close to your mic, which is what I have to do.
Okay, and my next comment is, while I appreciate the inter-scoring reliability, it would, to really try to mitigate the conflict of interest as much as possible. This is just something to consider, and I'm not going to say bring it back to the board or anything like that, but something to consider is having a blind process, a blind RFP process, when the charter needs to choose who they are going to provide these contracted services. I mean, to say that there's choice and they don't have to choose you is okay, but I just can't imagine any school not hiring the hand that feeds them. So I would say if there was a way to make that a blind process where maybe they have to look at 3 companies at the services they offer, but not know which organization is doing the offering, and then they select based on cost and services provided, that might mitigate some of that appearance of conflict of interest there.
So, Board Member Davis, one of the things that will follow in this case is the state procurement rules. So, I think if the amount is over 5,000, which likely this would be, that they would have to go through a procurement process, and that does require multiple bids. So we're required to do that at the university anyway, so it kicks us into that process.
Thank you for that. Are those, I'm trying to remember if that is the number marker that requires a blind process or if that's higher.
I think it is. The school actually runs the procurement. That doesn't get run through CSF or university.
Great. That's really helpful. Thank you so much for answering. And then the last question is, as I was reading through some of your documentation, I noticed that you had mentioned that by authorizing these charter schools, it might also be a good opportunity for Utah State student teachers and interns. And I'm wondering, do you plan on, most schools cap the number of interns they have in the building to 2. Do you plan on having caps or putting all of your student teachers and interns into these charter schools? And where an intern is an actual contracted employee, does that also create some kind of a conflict of interest? Could you address some of that for me?
Well, I think certainly we've heard interest from charter schools to have more access to teacher pipeline, and student teaching is such a critical juncture for making connections with prospective teachers. I think that's why we placed that information in there. We're going to have to see to what degree charter schools want us to provide that access, and then obviously the questions you're raising will be questions that we have to address both from the university side and the charter school side. Right now, my understanding is charter schools have very limited access to student teaching or interns. So there has been interest expressed to us from various charter school parties to at least have that conversation.
Sure. And just as a follow-up, I'm just wondering if this is going to be kind of like, I know a lot of student teachers go through the Edith Bowen School and actually makes them very strong. I've hired some of your folks coming out of Utah State and they're fabulous. But I'm wondering, when it comes to the employee end of that, say a school that you authorize has hired 5 interns from Utah State University, and this person is maybe doing something, but we can't fire him or her because they're also the student authorizer. Will there be, are there discussions to mitigate some of those potential conflicts?
Yeah, I think as the agent of the Board of Trustees, CSF will be involved in the authorization process as we've laid out here. The student teaching assignments actually come from an academic unit, the School of Teacher Education and Leadership, as well as special ed. So they're not really we have no control over the student teachers or the interns. That comes through academic programs. So it would actually be a totally separate decision. We may act on behalf of charter schools if they say, hey, we'd love to have student teachers or interns. We would connect them with the people who make those decisions in our academic units, but it's not run through CSF.
Perfect. That answers my questions, and it sounds great. Thanks so much.
You bet.
Thank you, Board Member Davis. Thanks for your responses. I had one more question, if that's okay. And I don't need a long answer. I just need, and if you don't really have detailed information, that's great too. I'm just, have seen this problem as an ongoing problem with charter schools, just to preface my question. And that is the two, and I've said this before, but I want to say it as a final time because I have you folks wanting something from us. And that is the two problems I've seen with charter schools are board stability, which I as I'm recalling, you addressed in your second iteration of your application. And then the second thing is compliance with all public school requirements, laws, policies, etc. And when I brought this up a month or two ago about having legal assistance sometimes to follow through with that, you said, "Oh, we'll do that through USU." It helped me if you have anything more, have done anything more, or if you have anything more formal outlined right now to have a lawyer through USU or otherwise available to work with you on a regular basis to maintain compliance.
Yeah, I think, thank you for the question. I think since USU Board of Trustees is the authorizing body, it would be in their purview to decide on what legal counsel they access. My experience has been that they typically work with the attorney that's assigned to them through the Attorney General's office. So I think that would probably still be the case if anything of a legal matter came up. I don't know. There probably are cases where they contract with outside counsel, but I'm not, it'd be hard to say what scenario would trigger that on behalf of them. That's their decision. The other issue would be the board training. We like you recognize that board is key to the success of the school. And so we've built in training sessions for board members that we'll be giving both in the application process as well as once they're in place as a charter school.
I saw that and I appreciated that in your new and improved application. So I would just urge you to stay and you folks, you and David are very clear about requirements for not just charter schools, but public schools. So I feel like you will be very conscious of those requirements being met. But I'm just, it constantly frustrates me that is a hard thing for schools to stay consistent with what they don't, when they don't have consistent access to someone. And it doesn't have to be an attorney. It can be just someone whose primary responsibility is compliance. And one school is manageable. If you end up with 3 or 5 in 5 years, that gets harder. So just a suggestion. Thank you so much. I think with that, if you folks are finished with your presentation, we can go to the committee to ask for a motion.
Just for clarification, Board Member Lear, this is Angie Stallings. I don't know if there's a motion that's needed. I believe that yesterday in the report out, the board approved their remediation process.
Right. Thank you. Never mind. Thank you for being here. You are so right. We already approved this once and we just wanted to follow up. So thank you for that reminder, Angie. And thanks for your attendance and for your willingness to be so collaborative with us.
Thank you. Thank you again for your support, and we look forward to working with you more in the future.
Sure. Absolutely. Thank you. And I think with that, let's move on to item 3.2, which is another action item, State Charter School Board Expansion Approval Process. And let me just state, because this is the first item on which we have members of the public who would like to speak, that we will have their comments first, and then the committee will discuss the matter, and there will probably not be another opportunity for the public to comment because we need to move this along, and And we would like to hear your comments, but at the beginning of the discussion. So with that, I have two people, if I'm correct, Angie, who've signed up to speak. Two members of the State Charter School Board, Cindy Phillips and Elena Tonks. And we'll take you in that order, and then you will each have 3 minutes, if you'll please be true to that. So with that discussion, go ahead, Ms. Phillips.
Member Lear, would it be possible for Ms. Tonks to go first? Because we, okay, thank you.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for the time, Chair Lear. We certainly appreciate it, and we appreciate the opportunity to present on our expansion request today. I'm just going to give a brief overview and introduction, and then Director Lambert and Member Phillips will provide specifics as well. So I'd like to frame the beginning of our presentation in terms of past, present, and future. And we thought it would be helpful to provide a brief overview of what an expansion request is and is not. So an expansion request can be a couple of different things, including an increase in the total number of students or an increase in the number of grade levels, or both of those things. And depending on which scenario above is in play, there may need to be additional space to house the increase in enrollment or in grade levels, which may include a physical building expansion, but that's not a requirement, and that may not happen in certain circumstances. So an expansion request is not a satellite request, and sometimes it's hard to keep all of those straight. And a satellite request is an additional request for an additional campus or a building. So we really appreciate the robust collaboration and the productive conversations that we've had between USBE and SCSB board members and staff as we wrestled to really strike the right balance for our process, which provides USBE the opportunity to exercise general control and supervision, as it states in the Constitution, while the State Charter School Board maintains the authorizer role of implementing the approval process specifically as designated by the legislature. USBE statutorily holds the State Charter School Board accountable for the designing of the process, and then the onus is placed on the school to provide evidence of meeting the requirements of the process. And what's happening here today is a textbook case of how things should operate as outlined in statute. As we work through this process, there are things that we will be doing in the future as well. And there are already plans underway to make the minimum requirements with a self-evaluation for interested schools to signal what is going to be happening if they're requesting an expansion. And also, we'd like to take a look at doing some sort of a required boot camp so that schools interested in expansion requests can come see exactly what the process looks like and be given guidance up front prior to even engaging in the process. So that is a brief little overview, and I believe Member Phillips is going next, and then Director Lambert, although I may be wrong.
Thanks, and thank you for keeping it short. And I was informed by Angie that you are also here to facilitate or participate in discussion, which we will do to some amount, but I really feel like this is the board committee's discussion, so that's what we'll focus on. With that, go ahead, Cindy. Cindy?
Am I unmuted at this point?
You seem to be. I hear you.
Very good. That's my question.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Chair Lear. I know you're the chair of this committee for allowing me to speak as well. If you could sneak to page 2 of this, whoever's in charge of this document, thank you. First of all, I would like to address, I know you can all read what's here, but I would like to address just very briefly some of the concerns that have been expressed in previous meetings or communications, and how philosophically and practically this process, as now reflected in this document, I believe, addresses those concerns. In particular, I'd like to point out these 2 checkboxes up here. These checkboxes are largely a result of collaboration and suggestions, recommendations from Member Cummins and Member Lear to reflect what the state does, the USB in particular, in other processes where there is an assurance given that is equated to compliance. More about that briefly in a moment. Philosophically speaking, what this list represents is, it's a representative list of the most substantive, I would say, administrative compliance requirements. And I want the committee to keep in mind that as reflected on the USBE's own website on administrative compliance rules, there are currently 196 effective administrative rules that schools need to demonstrate compliance to in one way or another. And so I know that Member Lear in particular, and I actually appreciate this point of view, has been interested in evidence rather than simply assurances. But I would point out that I think this process strikes a very nice balance by having a representative substantive list that, as well as that provides evidence, as well as by applicant assurances, which is the combination of things that the USBE does in virtually every compliance measure. And it would be too much of a burden, really, an excessive burden to seek sort of all imaginable evidence and information when you were verifying compliance. So this is I think a nice balance based on the need for and the desire for substantive evidence before an expansion request is considered, but not so much that it is ticky-tacky or burdensome or replicates evidence that is easily acquired in other ways. An example, just a brief example that will illustrate the point, I think, well. One of the recommendations had been maybe having some additional evidence for student safety. And if you'll recall, when the anti-bullying and anti-cyberbullying things were first passed, you had a situation where there was a specific form that was unique and discrete that was handed in to the USBE to demonstrate compliance that included a policy and implementation pieces. Over time, and the statute has allowed this because it really says the superintendent will set the parameters of how these sorts of things are to be submitted and demonstrated. That has morphed over the last few years into an assurance on the regular June 30th deadline assurances to the USBE that also includes a link to the policy. And so with that, I simply want to say that I think that this process and the document that is provided here reflects the best practices right now at the USBE as well in providing modest evidence and assurances in combination to demonstrate compliance. And you look there, we have student privacy, student fees, student suicide prevention, discipline and safety, the Open and Public Meetings Act, et cetera.
Another 20 seconds.
Yeah, please head to the next page then as well.
Okay.
And if you'll notice this too, this also provides the process with a way for charter schools to reflect on their own, as they are the ones who are actively seeking this expansion, the evidence necessary for fidelity to their charter. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Director Lambert, would you like to speak too?
Sure, and I guess there's a little bit of confusion. Is this a presentation? Did you want to hear? Because that's what I believe we understood of what we were doing.
No, I was actually going to look for, well, yeah, that you can continue. I'm sorry, you're right. I was thinking there was another staff person who would do that, but that would be you. So if you have more to say, and if you want to then involve Cindy, but I think we've been over a lot of this a couple of times. So I think we can move to questions unless there's more that you have to add.
Well, if I can just, if you don't mind, Chair Lear, I would like to just kind of quickly go over things. I promise I will be short. I do want to emphasize what Chair Tonks talked about was kind of the overarching what an expansion is. Member Phillips talked about what would be the review that would allow us to accept the application. I believe that's been some of the holdup, not with the expansions, but with satellites. And I do want to note, this is not a satellite process. We expect that we'll be submitting that to you for next month, but this is for expansions. So once it is determined that the school meets the minimum requirements to submit an application, then there is review done where the school certifies. And if you move to the next page, whoever's running the.
Thank you for the page numbers, by the way. Page 4, do you want us on?
You're welcome. So actually go to page 5. That's probably a better example. So not page 5, page 6, sorry. There you go. So then what we have is we have a section for each of the major areas. We've got market analysis, charter fidelity, academics, operations, which includes, we added in governance because we feel that's very important, as well as then financial and then facilities. And on each one, we ask the school, because it allows them to think about and make sure that they agree that they meet, that they're doing well in each of these areas. And then they have to provide narrative and data to convince the state charter school board that they, in fact, do meet all of these areas and are well performing in all of these areas. So then the state charter school board would receive this application and review the narrative and the data presented. Staff would also provide additional information as needed, such as what surrounding schools are doing in terms of performance. And then they would take all of that together, and then in a board meeting that would be before October 1st, which is the timeline that is in board rule. We normally would have it in our August meeting, but this year it's going to have to be our September meeting because we don't have our process approved yet. But in that board meeting, the state charter school board would then ask that school questions, get clarifications, find out more information, and then based on all of that information, they would make decisions whether or not to approve the expansion.
Okay, thank you. Anything else? Since you are the presentation, if I cut off Cindy or Delana inappropriately, I think we would all like to hear anything additional that is adds to what you've already presented.
May I just add something then, Member Lear?
Sure, please.
This is Cindy Phillips speaking. I recall that one of the concerns that you had earlier in considering adding additional evidence was even perhaps a few items, and I'll give one as an example, that might not be required of LEAs in general. And what, we definitely want these people who are asking, these schools, these LEAs who are asking for expansions to have demonstrated excellence in the variety of areas that are reflected. But I wanted to remind you that one of the things that you had wanted was perhaps a demonstration of a policy that required the LEA itself, a LEA policy, a local board policy, to review the policies that they have with, every 2 years. And while that's a best practice, it's actually not required by statute or rule, except for some specific policies like the comprehensive emergency plan that each LEA has. So one thing I think that this document, as now represented, includes all of the sort of very best recommendations that have come from this committee, which has been such a great collaborative process, and avoids sort of adding onto the process requirements that aren't even reflected in rule or that would be burdensome in a way that is unnecessary. So I want to thank you as having been part of that collaboration. I didn't get a chance to thank this committee for the extensive work that they've put into helping us as a state charter school board make this a much better document and process.
And thank you, Cindy. Let me just clarify, because now my name's come up a couple of times. I suggested to Director Lambert that could be an optional piece of information, evidence that a school could provide, demonstrating the school's conscientious effort in making sure that everything that the law requires is in place. I never suggested that it had to be done. I said it would be a good optional piece of information for both the state charter board and the state board as it then looked over the requirements for the school. And then I also need to probably preface that comment with saying these are not schools that are just submitting information to the board to say, are we doing this okay? These are schools who are asking for a streamlined process to say we are so awesome that we should be expanded per the law. So I think there is I believe there is an extra burden on the school to say it is not just barely meeting qualifications that a traditional school or a charter school would, who's not asking for a benefit, but we are doing more. We are demonstrating that we are high performing, we are exemplary. So that's why I personally don't think it's asking too much to ask these schools for an extra effort. So I wanted to be sure that was clarified. Now we have some questions, if that's okay, from board members. Board Member Cummins.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the presentation from the State Charter School Board and the presentation on this plan. Thank you. It's very thorough and it closely follows our rules. I do just want to ask for some clarification from the comment that was just, Chair, that you just made on a streamlined process, because this is the only way for a school to get an expansion. There is no other option. It's not streamlined. It's a longer process for expanding. It's the only expansion process. And some schools are just trying to add to their numbers, where a traditional school, they don't have to worry about caps. They don't have a number of students or whatever. They can automatically adjust to the demand in their area without having to seek permission from USBE. And so to assume that charter schools are going above and beyond what is expected or allowed for a school, I think is not quite accurate. They're just looking to meet the demand in the area and need to seek for permission. I do agree that all schools should be compliant and have the ability to show that they are compliant to rule and law. And so I don't think that this is an over asking of schools to do, because all of these things are a pretty high level of requests that are asked as they show the evidence. But I just making sure that we're not giving the unclear explanation that somehow these charter schools are asking for something above and beyond what should be expected normally.
And to that, and I appreciate that comment, Vice Chair Cummins, but I stand by my comment that if a school wanted to have a different configuration, it could go back through the amendment process and or the new school process. So I do believe this is a variation, not as much as the satellite, but I do think it's a variation on the approval process. And I believe the school is asking for something that is unusual and exceptional. Even though it is a charter school and even though it's different than a traditional school, the rules are frequently different. So I stand by my comment. These should be exceptional schools in order to be able to expand under the current charter school law. So thank you. I guess we'll just agree to disagree and we'll move on. Others, I have several comments that I'd like to make, but I'll wait until other board members have made any comments they have. Anybody else? Committee members, Board Member Davis, Committee Member Davis.
I really just want to say thank you for the process. Thank you for the exchange. I know that we've had several conversations back and forth between USBE members and Utah State Charter School Board members, and it has been a learning process for me, definitely. And I feel like the tone has been nothing but professional, and I appreciate all the stakeholders and parties that have been involved. So thank you for the process.
Thank you, Cindy. Other committee members, I'm looking for hands and not seeing any. Angie, if I'm missing any, let me know. I don't see any.
Yeah, I don't see any either.
Let me raise 3-4 concerns I have. They're not as much concerns, and I would not hold up the approval process for this, but in the spirit of the next time the board reviews the information we received from the State Charter Board, I would hope we would have this clarifying information so that no one would say on the board or on the State Charter Board, it was unclear, they didn't know what was expected, and now you're asking for something special. So these are clarifying pieces of information that I would hope you would at least consider adding. First of all, I would ask for 3 definitions, either at the beginning of the document or within the document. Market analysis, that is a term of art for some, but it is not in this document. I would ask for a better, not just a bulleted description, but a definition. Would it be by a third party? How recent would it be? How formal would it be? I would ask for a definition of that. I would ask for a definition of academic success. It is noted in the document, but what is academic success? Is that based on a school-wide standardized test? Is it based on graduation rates? Is it if it's the right kind of school? So I'd like a definition of academic success. And thirdly was financial viability. I would ask for a definition of financial viability. Is this X number? And that is better explained in the document than the other 2. But is this X number of dollars in the bank? Is this X number? You're much more familiar with what viability would look like, and it's probably so familiar to you that you feel comfortable using the phrase, but it's not always comfortable to state board members, and it may not be as familiar for those applying for expansion. So I asked for a definition of financial viability. In fact, in your document, you say if a school is not meeting the standard, but it doesn't, I don't think, clearly provide the standard of financial viability. And if you want to reference a rule, if you want to reference a federal regulation, that's great. But I would like a clear definition so that when this comes before the board again, board members can objectively measure these things to some extent. And the final thing is student safety, which has been a very current topic, is one of your elements in your application. And I would appreciate, as we discussed yesterday, and it would be so easy, and this kind of goes to a couple of other items too, and also to the remarks that board member Phillips made, that I think as the school is asking for these, for this opportunity to expand, that it is the school's responsibility to put the documents in the hands of those who will review it. Not to say, well, you can check with so-and-so or you can check online. That the school should present its safety report, its school safety report that now is being developed in 2 different sections of the State Board of Education. And that would be true for a number of other items. Instead of checking on the administrative credentials, I think the applicant should provide that information and not expect the reviewer to go to Cactus or another source. That information should be provided with the application so that it's readily available, and then it can be communicated readily to board members who may have questions about evidence. So I would just make those requests so that there's more objective evidence of the appropriateness of an expansion in this case than there has been in the past. And so we won't have to have that discussion again about, certainly there's an assurance, but where's the underlying evidence? And I would appreciate that. And then we wouldn't have to, again, have the kind of discussions that we had previously. So with that, I will just ask you if you'll consider that. I don't think, I personally don't need this to come back to the committee. I would like to have a response from the director or the board chair about adding those definitions for clarity's and objectivity's sake. But I don't want to hold up this process because I agree with Board Member Davis. This has been, you've done a good job in trying to add what we talked about before. So with that, accepting unless there's anything else to add, board members or charter people, I'm ready for a motion. Board member Cummins. Oops. Board member Cummins, was that your hand anew?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, and I'm sorry, Angie.
I did have one comment, but I'm happy to defer to board member Cummins first if she'd like to speak first.
Okay. Go ahead, Brittany, go ahead.
I wanted to speak and then make a motion. I just want to be cautious that we don't give too much specific instruction to them to put changes. I think their document is adequate at this point as far as definitions. We didn't require definitions of the USU's application process. And I think it's just recognizing that I think this is an adequate document where they have defined what's important, but it leaves a little bit of discretion. As far as market analysis, it describes some of the things that they want them to describe and consider. I just want us to be careful that we don't continue to pile on more requirements from our side that aren't necessary. And then I would just.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Brittany, but it's necessary for me to have objective information that hasn't been available in the past. So with that, Angie, do you want to add anything?
Yes, what I was going to mention is we could, if you would like it, we could bring the rule back and add some of those definitions to the rule so that they apply to all authorizers. And we'd be happy as staff to do that if you'd like, or if the committee would like.
I don't know that the committee would support my concerns. I'm just saying if we come back to another discussion like we've had for the last 3 months and there isn't objective evidence, and I was trying to make that crystal clear this time instead of being told by board members as well as state charter board members, well, you didn't tell us what you wanted. So I wanted to be crystal clear. I think we've got this recording, and if there are questions in the future, I am happy to refer back to this recording and say we asked for objectivity and we got what we got. So Brittany, did you have something to add?
Yeah, and I would just say that, based on this recording, it's one board member's thoughts on what we should require, not a committee motion or a board motion, which would be reflected in a rule change. So that's why I think moving forward with Angie's concept would allow the full board to decide what we're looking for rather than just relying on a conversation and trying to interpret individual board intent in that.
Great. I think that would be great. If you would like to make that motion.
Well, I'd like to move that we approve the state charter school board's expansion process.
And you don't want to add that with Angie's definition suggestion then?
I would think that would be a separate committee motion to bring back the rule, right?
You're asking to have it approved. I'm fine about that. I would not be making that additional motion, and I acknowledge it's one committee member and one board member, but I also feel like there was inadequate information in the past, and I wanted to avoid that going forward. So yes, I'm satisfied with your motion, and I'm satisfied with the recording. So thank you. The motion is to approve the charter school board expansion request. A second to that motion. I guess we don't need it in committee. So all in favor, and I think you can vote by raising your hands, I think. That I can see. Any further discussion to that motion, I should say, before you vote, committee members? Then vote with your hands.
It looks like we've got all 4 board members other than you having voted yes.
And I will vote yes just now. I don't see those on my screen.
Yes, I can see them, but yes, it's unanimous. All 5 of you voted in favor.
Thank you. Thank you, Charter Board people.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is, sorry, I'm looking, R277-100, and this would be Ben Rasmussen. And actually, Cindy Phillips has asked to speak to this too. So Cindy, would you go ahead first, and then we'll hear from Ben Rasmussen.
Yes, my comments are very short. I'm speaking in favor of the modifications and the way the draft appears now. And I just wanted to mention that I think it addresses the concerns from both sides. My concern was that I didn't want a third grader's misstep following them into the 8th grade where they might want to be part of the honor society. And so I felt that every little part of a student's discipline record should not be included in the CUME file, and especially those that are specifically asked to be destroyed by the end of the year. And for those big things, schools typically suspend and expel, and those are part of the record. They have to be entered into UTREX anyway through the report of your student information system. And I feel that those big things that we're all worried about, a student might hide or a parent might hide from an enrolling school, would appear now with the CUME file, including records of suspensions and expulsions. So I just want to thank everybody for the amount of work that's been done on it, and I feel like it addresses the concerns that were voiced in the last time this was reviewed. Thanks.
Thank you. And I kind of put the cart before the horse. So Ben, do you want to speak to the rule generally before we have further committee discussion?
I'd be happy to, Chair. Ben Rasmussen, Director of Law and Professional Practices. If you remember, during the discussion in committee last month, there was concern about this definition of cumulative file or cumulative folder and how much record regarding student discipline should be in there. After the committee meeting, staff met and discussed what the legal requirements were, and ultimately the staff recommendation that you find in draft 3 is that the cumulative file should have a record of suspensions and expulsions, which is required by state law. The cumulative file may also contain additional information, and that was the staff recommendation concerning that. Whitney Phillips is on the call. We'd be happy to answer questions you may have regarding this.
I'll hold my questions to committee members. Have any clarifying questions for Rasmussen or for
Board Member Lear, this is
Yes.
Angie Stallings. I forgot to mention during the ending or the closing of the last item, Delana Tonks had raised her hand as wanting to provide public comment on the last item, but I wasn't able to make note of it before we switched to R277-100. So she does have her hand raised, or did just a moment ago. If you would allow her, she wanted to make one final comment related to the last item.
That's fine with me. Sorry to interrupt, Ben.
And Malia Height, you need to unmute yourself.
And yes, anybody else? And I guess without objection from the committee, Ms. Tonks.
Oh, is it, Delana, is it about the State Charter School Board expansion process, or were you wanting to make comment on the rule R277-750? I apologize.
I'll be really brief. I just wanted to thank the committee for their time and for the collaboration, and we're excited to move forward. We're clear on where we need to head and appreciate all of the input and feedback that we received. And then I would like to make public comment on the SPED item when that's appropriate.
Okay, you're gonna have to sit around for a while. Sorry. Thank you. Yes, I'll add that to the list of people to speak. Thank you. Thanks, Angie, for that. Okay, Ben, sorry to be a little disorganized there, but go ahead, Ben. If you have more to add, are you ready for questions?
The only other thing I would add, Chair, is just to remind the board members that there's also one other definition added that we're asking to add in here. That's on line 120, the multi-team disciplinary team. There wasn't a lot of conversation about that last time. but just to remind you that that is also part of this draft.
Thank you. And then with that, I thought I saw Board Member Davis. Was that right?
That is correct. She has her hand raised.
Okay, go ahead, Board Member Davis, Committee Member Davis.
Thanks. I just kind of want to reiterate that I don't think that every part of a disciplinary action needs to be put into the cumulative plan, but I think when we just specifically call out suspensions and expulsions, we are sort of having our rules that are a little bit ancient, because really the world is moving forward in restorative practices and a lot of positive interventions. And I wish that we could see those put in the CUME file so that when a student transfers to a new school, there's a launching place for the new school to pick up. And maybe there are some suspensions, but maybe there have been some rich interventions that have worked and could be built upon in the new school. So I wish there was some language to that. I had mentioned this in the last meeting too. I'll vote for this to move it forward, but it just in a wish list, if we ever bring it back again, I think we need to look in a forward thinking language rather than a retroactive language, which is the suspension and expulsion language. Thanks.
Thank you. Good point. Any other board member comments? I have one because I kind of caused this problem, I think. But go ahead. Is there anyone else? Angie, was that you to speak or no? Any other board member questions?
No one else. No hands are raised.
Just one aside, because I think I was maybe a stimulus for bringing this back. The way this is written without, I didn't like that it might have been limited to the current record of suspensions and expulsions, and I like taking that current word out. I also, my second point is that I think there is a balance in forwarding, exchanging CUME files between allowing a student to move forward without baggage, but also protecting the safety of the school that he's moving to. I've talked to many schools over the years that received students who had serious problems, and that information was not communicated to the school, the new school. So I think it is important not only to respect the individual and his desire to start new, or her desire, but also to respect the safety of all students. And I agree with Cindy that interventions can be helpful. I also did an informal poll myself of superintendents and a few student services people who said that really expulsions are the most passé of all of these terms, and schools rarely expel. But they also said that we get the information we need from phone calls. So that also gave me greater comfort in the way this is written, that schools who are responsible and receiving new students, especially under unusual circumstances, should and can get what they need by a phone call or an email. So I think that satisfies my concerns. Any further comments by board members? If not, a motion is in order.
Board Member Cummins and Board Member Davis both have their hands raised.
I'm not seeing, oh, there they are. Board Member Davis.
I move that the committee continue and approve R277-100 Draft 3 on first reading and forward to the board for continuation and approval on second and final reading.
The motion is that the committee continue and approve R277-100 Draft 3 on first reading, forward to the board for continuation and approval on second and final reading. Any further discussion of that motion? All in favor, and can I just call your names because it's easier for me than to look up and down my list. So, Board Member Cummins.
Aye.
Board Member Davis.
Aye.
Board Member Haynes.
Aye.
Board Member Thorpe.
Aye.
The chair votes aye. Thank you. That's unanimous. Moving to the next item is R277-319, special educator stipends, which is a new rule. And again, that's Mr. Rasmussen.
Thank you, Chair. This rule covers the special educator stipend program, which is currently governed by R277-525. You have two rules before you. 319 renumbers the rule and updates the process for applying for the special educator stipend to some extent. We're putting it with the licensing rules number-wise. And then if this is approved, the recommendation would be to repeal R277-525. But 319 is the new rule. Tammy Gear is the coordinator that is responsible for that rule. I think she should be able to answer questions about the program if you have, well, she's not on here that I see, but we can try and answer questions if you have any.
Okay. Board members, do you have any questions, clarifying or otherwise? I'm not seeing any hands. Angie, am I missing any?
No, I agree with you. There are no hands.
Okay, so a motion's in order. Board
Member
Thorpe.
Thorpe.
I move that the committee approve R277-319 draft 1 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
And thank you very much. The motion is, let me turn my page. R277-319 draft 1 first reading forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. Any further discussion to that? Thank you. We'll take a vote. Board Member Cummins?
Aye.
Committee Member Thorpe?
Aye.
Member Davis?
Aye.
Member Haynes?
Aye.
And I vote aye also. So that was unanimous. Thank you very much, Ben. You want to move on to the next item, which is a repeal of R277-525.
So same issue, just repealing this rule, Chair.
Right, and which you've already explained and done well. Thank you very much. So a motion's in order. Board Member Thorpe.
I move that the committee repeal R277-525 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
Thank you. The motion is the committee repeal R277-525, first reading forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. Any further discussion to that motion? I see none. So we can vote. Member Davis?
Aye.
Member Thorpe?
Aye.
Member Cummins?
Aye.
And Member Haynes?
Aye.
Thank you.
Can I make a comment on that?
Oh, absolutely, please.
At the risk of being totally inappropriate, just noting that, you know, there are lots of great things with U-Star and our MOST program now that it's called, and we need to find some funding for any of those things to happen. Thanks, that's all.
I totally agree. I wish that were the case for every kind of teacher. You're right. Next item on the agenda is item 3.6, R277-492, Utah Science, Technology, and Research Initiative. Again, Ben Rasmussen.
Thank you, Chair. So this rule amendment comes as a result of legislative action from the last session. SB 93 changed the U-Star program to the MOST program, as Cindy just discussed. With this rule would implement the changes that the legislation anticipates. However, there is a funding issue for this program going forward. We have addressed that in the rule, that the changes are subject to legislative appropriation or subject to appropriations, so that when we get funding for that in the future, that this rule can be implemented. But we do want to have the recommendation is anyway is to have the rule on the books for when funding is obtained. We'd be happy to answer any questions the committee may have regarding this program and rule.
I just have a question that might be helpful for others. How much funding was attached to this? Angie?
This is it, yeah. So I think the amount prior to this last session was 4.8 million, and then we received an additional million or so. It was an additional million from the 2020 session. So my recollection is it's about 5.8 million.
So I was thinking of it in light of our
Oh.
discretionary fund, but I think that's a little rich for our budget. So thank you. That's
It's
helpful.
actually 6.3 million. Cami corrected me. Cami Dupree, she's here as well and can give more. So 6.3 probably originally with an extra 1 million or 1.1 million. So that would be 7.3 million total had coming out of the 2020 session that the program had that was cut.
That's helpful to me. Any other questions or comments by board members? I'm not seeing any hands. Wait, let me see what this chat is. Hang on a minute. 7.2 now it's getting to. Oh, it was million up and until it's okay. So we're up to 7.2 million. Still too much for our board discretionary fund. Oh, before it was cut, she said. Okay, thank you for the information. That's very helpful. Any other board member hands? I don't see anybody that would like to make a motion.
Board member Thorpe has raised her hand.
Okay, thank you for doing this, Lorianne. Go ahead.
My pleasure. I move that the committee approve R277-492 draft 1 on the first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
The motion is that the committee approve R277-492 draft 1 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. Any further discussion by board committee members? And I'm not seeing any. I finally have the group all together. Oh, wait, maybe not board member, not committee member Haynes. Are you? No.
I just turned my mic on, ready to vote. That's all. Sorry.
I was excited about potential comments. So, all right, then we'll take a vote. If you'll all please, let me just call your names. Member Cummins.
I'm an aye.
And Member Thorpe.
Aye.
Member Davis.
Aye.
And Member Haynes. And,
Aye.
And I vote yes also. So that's unanimous on R277-492. Thank you, and thanks for everyone who was available for our questions. The next item is item 3.7, an action item, R277-925, affected teachers in high poverty schools incentive program. And again, Mr. Rasmussen.
Thank you, Chair. So we've just got a few changes in this rule. We're implementing some changes that should have come long ago from the recodification the legislature did and somehow we missed. And we've added a couple of changes about who is eligible for the program that came through recent legislation. This is another rule that's in kind of a similar boat, as I understand it, as the MOST program, where there have been some cuts. So we also added language here making the rule subject to legislative appropriations. I'm not sure if this was entirely cut or just partially cut, but that's what you're looking for. Draft 2 is what staff is recommending.
Okay.
Lear, may I make just a supplemental comment to what Ben just stated?
Please.
The other issue with this program is that due to the assessment waiver or due to not administering assessments in the spring of 2020, these stipends will not be able to be distributed due to not having a growth score or a final benchmark assessment in reading. And so they didn't take all of the money. There is some money left. However, because there were no assessments, we will not be able to issue those stipends this year.
Oh, that's too bad. How much money, again, can I ask again on the same, similar to the last item, how much money was appropriated for this, or how much was the total for the program?
Would any of the staff members like to answer? Otherwise, I can give an estimated guess. I know it was $250,000 prior to the 2020 session. It did get some additional money, and I think that the additional money was cut, and that the 250 remains. But I could be wrong. Are there any staff members who'd like to correct me on that?
Angie, that is correct. This is Erica Horsley, by the way. That is correct.
Thanks, Erica. Any other board member questions? I don't see any hands. Then this is an amount that maybe the board discretionary funding, and I think there's two different pots, if I'm remembering right, might be used for. That's just a thought out loud. And then Darren Nielsen added that he thought the payment was on a 2-year delay. Is that right, Angie? Is that accurate?
And I guess that would be actually a better answer or question to ask Erica and Darren. I had understood that we weren't going to be able to provide those stipends this year and potentially next year to grades 4 through 8. But if they did the benchmark reading assessment, we might be able to do those next year because it's not a growth. I think Darren and Erica would be better at answering that question.
Okay, and then we also had a comment from the superintendent. So Erica, go ahead, and then I don't know if the superintendent's on, but she could also make.
No, I am, but I think Angie just described it actually, and it's Darren would be best to answer this.
That's right. We don't have the data. I know that. It's too bad. All right, Darren, do you have anything to add?
So yeah, thank you, Chair. I just was, as I read this rule and look at line 50 specifically, as we as staff determine whether teachers are eligible, if I'm interpreting this right, Erica could probably correct me on this. I've had conversations previously with Travis Rollins before he left the agency, but I believe we used the data from the 2 years prior to the year you're going to make payment based on what line 50 says,
Right.
which means this year we have data from 2 years prior. What we will lack is in 2 years, we'll be missing the 2020, both the end of year DIBELS or Acadience data that's being added through this House Bill 107, and we'll be missing the grades 3 through 8. It's actually just grades 4 through 8 because it uses the median growth percentile to determine whether a teacher's eligible. So it'd be 2 years from now. Erica, though, I'm open for correction on that.
Yes, that is how I understand it as well. We can pay this year, but it'll be for data from 2 years ago. So in 2 years, we won't have the data to pay the teachers this bonus, if that makes sense.
So other board member comments? I have one more, but I don't want to dominate more than I have. Any other board member comments? Committee member Davis.
This is another indulgent comment, and I'm sorry, but I just have to say that this is just one of those rules where we get in trouble where we add test scores into legislation. And, these folks may have stayed teaching in these difficult environments knowing that this was coming. And it's just one of those things. It feels like they got the rug pulled out from under them. And I think it really stinks. I wish there was a way to make the language not conditional upon the scores. I don't know what that is, but I wish there was a way to do it. Maybe for next year.
Thank you. I agree. Angie, so am I correct in assuming that because we do have the data from 2 years ago, we could, if we had the money or chose to use the money, we could pay these stipends? Is that right?
It sounds like, based on what Erica just mentioned, we will be able to provide the stipends this year because we do have the data from 2 years prior. That it won't be the impact won't be for a couple of years, a year or two out.
But we'd have to fund it with something other than a legislative appropriation.
Potentially, because we didn't get the extra funding to fund the first, second, and third grade teachers, and it might have included kindergarten, I apologize, but those teachers that were added this year, that funding was taken away.
Yes, Angie, that is correct. The additional funds were removed for grades K through 3.
And so when that happens, we would have to provide a prorated amount based on the loss of revenue.
Or could we also use our discretionary or any other board money?
Correct, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Just to put all of our options before us. Any other questions from board members, committee members? I'm seeing none. Then I think a motion might be helpful. There's one more chat. Okay. Scott Jones, I'm not sure how that.
Board member Cummins, has she raised her hand?
Okay, board member Cummins, please.
I move that we approve R277-525 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
Draft
2. Yeah, draft 2.
That also. Great. So the motion is that the committee approve R277-925 draft 2. Mine says draft 1, but draft 2. Is that right then, Ben? Draft 2?
What's on the screen is the correct recommendation, is draft 2.
Okay. Draft 2 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. A vote on that. Member Thorpe?
Aye.
Member Cummins?
Aye.
Member Davis?
Aye.
Member Haynes?
Aye.
And I also vote yes. So that's a unanimous vote. Thank you. Thank you for so many staff members who provided additional information and data about that. That was helpful to me, at least. Thanks. The next item on the agenda, moving right along, is a discussion of an action item on R277-750, education programs for students with disabilities, which would be amended. And I think that the person we'll turn to first, unless I've sort of done this, I think, backwards, and I apologize to those really patient people who've spoken before. I think if we had an explanation first, it might be better. Or does the committee prefer that we hear the comments before the explanation? I think that would have been a better way to proceed originally, and I didn't do it right. Angie.
I think that makes sense, Board Member Lear, to have Leah or others provide the background, and then we do have 5 people who would like to provide public comment.
And I only have 3 of them, so you'll have to help me. So thank you very much. If the committee doesn't mind, then we'll proceed first with an explanation from Associate Superintendent Voorhees, and then we'll move to public comment, and then we'll have committee discussion. So with that, Leah?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great.
I can.
So you can see what Ben has on the screen is I have been updating for you every month that we've been discussing the rules manual, the proposed updates month by month. So the end there, the July 2020 updates are all in purple, and the June 2020 updates in red are still in the manual so that you can kind of follow along with the proposed updates. So we basically have 6 and then a half that isn't on that list of proposed updates for you today that have all been consolidated into the version that is updated to Civic Clerk. So the first is, last month, you remember, we proposed alternate language and for sections U and V, and we just incorporated the alternate language for section U into the document, so it's no longer a separate document. We simplified the language in section V at the request of the feedback that we received from you and stakeholders last month. We added, because of the feedback that we received last month about from board members, from committee members about the language in the incidental benefit section, the permissive use of funds, we actually moved. So if you remember last month, there was an if statement with several sub-bullets. We actually moved the sub-bullets, the exceptions, into the allowable use section so we could separate out the exemptions because we heard from you that that would be clearer. And so that was one of the changes we made just to simplify. We updated section WXW just to match the language above, which was to take out the words time and effort, the references to time and effort. So we've taken that out. Section XW now matches that. And then we deleted some duplicate language that we found as a result of some stakeholder feedback in section 7 related to transition, the transition plan on an IEP. Then you may have noticed I uploaded to Civic Clerk a second version that has the little A. There it is. Ben's got it for you. That was at the request of Board Member Davis. There are, I think, 8 words added to that particular one. In the permissive use of funds section, she requested that we add the words except in a co-teaching setting, just to be very clear that co-teaching is an allowable use. So that is that version. That's the only difference, and you have the opportunity to look at that and consider if you would like to keep those few words that we added. So since our last meeting, at your request, you had asked me when we ended last meeting to ask special education directors if they had a percentage of students with disabilities in a class that would be taught by someone who was paid with special ed dollars. If they had a percentage that they felt best about and would request that you would add to the proposed rules. So I got them together. I want to although only one of them I think is on this meeting right now, but I want to thank them for quickly assembling to meet with me. The charter school directors, special education directors, and the district special education directors each have an association. And so I contacted the leadership of those 2 associations and discussed the questions that you had asked in the last meeting and the stakeholder feedback that we had received. And then they went and talked to their 2 different groups of special ed directors. Both the district directors and the special ed directors got online to discuss it. I really appreciate the feedback we got. We had more than 45 of them, I think, that actually showed up, and then we received other feedback by email. So the language that we present before you now was actually drafted in conjunction with some of them. And as a result of that conversation, I also contacted one of our technical assistants, our national technical assistance providers at WestEd, And they have a fiscal, a Center for IDEA Fiscal Accountability. I contacted our national TA provider, taking that feedback and asking them to help draft the language based on that feedback. And so that is the proposed language that you see before you.
Okay. And let's see before us on the screen, or where is that?
So in the 625 version of the rules. So
Okay.
the version that's uploaded to Civic Clerk.
So whoever is driving for us, the board, the committee members, could you scroll to that, or put that in front of us? Would that?
That's on the screen. It just depends on where you want to see it. It's about a 280-page document.
Yeah,
I know that too. So,
so this section right here, yeah, exactly where Ben is. This,
right.
Yeah, this is the updated language based on the collaboration of the special education directors, and then some help from our national TA provider.
okay, that's helpful.
Sorry, excuse me, Chair Lear. So in numbers 3 and 4 that you see on the screen here, it's those two numbers where Board Member Davis asked to inject the words except for in a co-teaching setting, that you would see those words injected in the 625A version.
Okay. All right, that's very helpful. I think those clarifications are helpful. I think there are, well, let's go to our public. Is that what you have to start with, Leah? And then we'll go to our public comment?
Yes, unless you had any specific questions about the feedback that we received and the current draft.
If committee members are all right, okay with this, I would think we'll proceed to public comment and then come back to you for additional questions, unless board members feel or committee members feel differently. So I'm looking for any hands of individuals who would like to ask clarifying questions first.
I like your approach, Chair. I'm happy with that.
Thank you, Committee Member Haynes. So with that, we'll have public comment. We have 5 people listed, and if I can't count that high, Angie will help me, and we'll do it in the order that you signed up, which is Cindy Phillips, Royce Van Tassel, Amy Trombetti, Aaron Preston, and then Delana Tonks, and you will each have 3 minutes. And this time I hope I'm not cutting off a presenter. And so I will get out my trusty timer and we'll stick with that. So you want to go ahead and start then? And I don't remember who I said. I think Cindy, you're first.
Thank you so much. I wanted to, first of all, thank Leah, Nate, and Cole for being so responsive to the recommendations of the committee and others who spoke in public comment in the last meeting. I want to speak for these changes that have been created and newly expressed in the rule. My fears were, as you know, a worry about not being able to have the co-teaching, as well as not having a reasonable standard for structured recesses and structured lunch that help so many of our students receiving special services to have same age peer interactions. And I was also concerned about how difficult it would be for LEAs to measure incidental benefit with the standard that had been set in the state language, which has been addressed now as one or more, kind of reverting back to the federal language. And I think that the definition that was added for co-teaching and the way that that makes explicit that it is allowed, so that you have a structured plan and it's allowable expense, is extremely helpful. So thank you so much. All of my concerns that I had have been entirely addressed by this new language.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you, Cindy. Next, and I have to,
Royce Van Tassel, I believe, is next.
Royce, please.
Good afternoon. It is, as always, a pleasure to be with you. I've appreciated the opportunity to talk and exchange emails with you about the concerns that I've expressed over the past several months and this week. As you know, my concerns largely focus on the extent to which the current revisions preserve the ability of an LEA to exercise a degree of judgment. This latest iteration feels like it is very much a prior permission before any changes are implemented, and that seems to fly significantly in the face of the kinds of local control and local knowledge that we expect our LEAs to use. I also remain very concerned that the rules, as discussed, do not place as much weight on providing the specially designed instruction or other services that are required in the student's IEP in the least restrictive environment. As one of the bullet points noted, and as Leah described earlier, when you have a group of more than 10 students, the current draft suggests that half or more of the students in that group would need to have an IEP that requires that specific activity, and I think that almost inevitably, given the prevalence numbers of special education within public schools, as well as the diversity of requirements in public schools, what those IEPs require, means that you will have to, in those groups of 10 or more, almost inevitably be a pull-out model as opposed to a push-in model. And push-in is explicitly designed to be less restrictive as opposed to the more restrictive that pull-out requires. And so I worry that this iteration does not preserve the kinds of local decision-making that we should expect LEAs to exercise, and we don't place sufficient weight on the value of least restrictive environment in this iteration of the special education manual. Thank you.
Thank you. Angie, I'm not keeping track as well as you are.
The next person would be Amy Trombetti.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank the committee for last time hearing me out and for giving me this opportunity again. And I really just want to say that since the last committee meeting, I want to thank the USBE staff, Leah, Nate, and Cole specifically, had conversations with me. I felt heard. I felt like they were listening. I felt like they were really working through the scenarios of what we face in, the day-to-day world. I also sent out the information to about 50 charter schools that I work with and the Outback group, the rural area, and did get some response and brought that back to Leah and Nate and Cole. And I just feel like the rules now really feel like I can work with those. They feel good. I think there's good accountability. I think there's good things for kids in that rule that will benefit them. And so I'm just really in favor of all the changes in this draft. And I also want to say, in working in special education, a lot of times looking at these rules, there's case law and there's intent and there is being reasonable. And that is the lens that I used when I was looking through all of the changes. And I think as long as the intent and being reasonable is how you're interpreting how to best serve kids, I think it's there. So anyway, I just want to thank everybody, and I also am very proud that some of the things and language I suggested are in there, and I think that just goes to the USBE staff, really listening and working through things. So that's all I have to say. I'm in favor.
Thank you. Just a clarification, Amy, you didn't state who you were representing, or do you want that, or no?
No, just no. I'm just here as me. I guess I have a company called Spedco, if that matters to anybody, but this was more about, just going through this and really understanding it, because I do work with several LEAs in a couple of different capacities.
Okay. Thank you very much for your
Thanks.
Angie?
Yes, next would be Erin Preston and then Delana Tonks.
Thank you.
Hi, board members. I appreciate you listening to me last month on my legal opinions on this. This time I am speaking as a mother who happens to also be a former director of an LEA. My request first is that this be put before finance directors, before administrators, and before LEA boards. I think good work has been done by working with the special education directors in making the changes that have been made. But from my vantage point, I see these business folks, the administrators and boards, having the responsibility to fund staff, create policy and procedure for changes that are in the audit provisions and in the rules that I don't think have yet been quantified or analyzed without them. And so that's my request. Now I'm going to switch to mom for a moment. I have some issues with the reliance on the co-taught classes, and here's my story. About 2 years ago, my husband died suddenly. My 13-year-old son, who had been doing very well academically and socially to that point, became very depressed and anxiety-ridden. In various efforts to help him, including medical and others, I met with the Jordan School District and requested an IEP evaluation. He was put on an IEP and allowed accommodations such as being able to listen to music, go to the counselor's office if he was having a panic attack, and such. These were accommodations that I believe could have been handled by his current teachers, allowing him to stay in the same class with his friends whose emotional support was pretty important to him at the time. Instead, the school district changed his schedule and moved him to different core classes. It was only from my conversations with him afterwards, or during that time, that I learned that he had been put in, as he called it, the dumb kid class. And in his description of the students, I realized he had been placed in the class that had a variety of student categorizations, autism, behavior, others. I also learned that from him that the classes were constantly chaotic. He now had 2 teachers, neither of which he liked. And because of his changed schedule, he could no longer have lunch with his friends. So he was in a co-taught class. It was something that was never discussed in his IEP. What happened next? He quit going to school. A lot of bad things happened. His condition deteriorated. This was not an IEP decision. It was not a good decision for my son. I don't want a default to a co-taught class. I want the default to be to the IEP as determined through the IEP process. I worry that the funding aspect would lean that scenario. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And Angie next.
And last is Delana Tonks.
Thank you, Angie, and thank you, Chair Lear. I am just making a general statement about the State Charter School Board, and that we want all students to have access to an excellent education that meets their unique learning needs. We focus on individual student success and academic excellence, and as such, we support efforts to improve rules and guidance regarding special education services in order to better serve students with an IEP. We also support innovation and school autonomy to meet the needs of all students. We do not believe there is a single way to approach education, and we ask that while you consider these changes to rule and guidance, you also ensure that you allow for different approaches in special education programs that yield positive student outcomes while exercising good stewardship of public funds. And we appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's all right, Angie.
I agree. If there's anybody we missed, if you could raise your hand, but I think we have everyone.
Royce and Delaney, you need to take your hands down if you could.
Oh, and yeah, I won't confuse her. I don't think with the committee. All right, with those public comments, and thank you so much. It is not easy to come and speak for only a few minutes. I know that this medium is not particularly conducive to providing helpful and in some cases personal information. So as a board member, I appreciate your effort. Thank you so much. With that, I think we can turn to the board or the committee members for some discussion. If you have clarifying questions, and I think we can blend them as far as I'm concerned. If you have clarifying questions of Dr. Voorhees or Nate, Dearden is also on the phone, I saw, or on the line, or somehow connected. If you have questions of anyone else who's available, that'd be great. But I would like to continue to discuss this. So with that, any discussion from committee members? Member Cummins.
Yes, thank you. We had a couple of comments from the public, and we've received emails as well about kind of the possible implications on a push-in model, as well as kind of that idea of singling students out in a way, like the finances of how you can apply some of these SPED rules might cause students to be singled out or pushed into larger group settings to accommodate the cost or to make sure that the cost is covered under the SPED rules. I was wondering if Leah would be willing to speak to those two concerns. What would a good push-in model look like under these rules? And what are some options that schools have to use their funds efficiently, but not feel like they have to clump students in a way that singles them out? So.
Thank you. Dr. Voorhees.
I'm happy to respond. Thank you for asking that question. It's a really important one. And it really gets to one of the purposes of the IDEA, which is that students have access to and make progress in the general curriculum. Because students with disabilities are first general education students. But we have years and years of history Public Law 142 in 1989, where students with disabilities were not doing well, just sitting in a classroom with regular core instruction. And when the IDEA was passed, that's when IEPs came into effect, and the definition of specially designed instruction was introduced. The fact that students with disabilities might need instruction that is different than and that is in addition to core instruction. So then we've had about 40 years of research of implementing IEPs and what really makes a difference for students with disabilities. And to be very honest, students with disabilities are still significantly behind their general education peers when it comes to mastery and proficiency as a group, which is really unfortunate. IDEA was put into place to try to close the gap, and we have not necessarily done that. But we do have 40 years of research that demonstrates that there are practices that do help close the gap. They're providing, so one of the things you have to consider in answering that question is students with disabilities are on a continuum, just like all of us are on a continuum. Our literacy, our mathematics, our knowledge, our skill, we're on a continuum. The majority of students with disabilities have either a specific learning disability or a speech language impairment. But interestingly enough, the proficiency and mastery of those two groups is almost polar opposite. Students with speech language impairments, if provided services and supports in addition to core instruction, speech and language services, they generally can perform almost as well or as well as their general education peers. That is not the case, unfortunately, for students with specific learning disabilities. And part of the reason is because the most common learning disability is in reading. And once you get past third grade, you use reading to learn as opposed to learning to read. So what the research demonstrates is that when students are provided with accommodations to help them access the material, so if they have visual graphics to go along with what they're reading and being introduced to, if they have the material on a CD or on audio to go along with what they're being introduced to, if they have outlines, and if they have prompts and cues, if they have note takers, that they are better able to access the information that all the other kids are accessing, because that's the first goal of the IDEA, is to access the information. The second goal is to make progress. And the research demonstrates, and our experience here in classrooms in the state of Utah, our experience is that once they have accessed the information, then they most often need extra opportunities, supplemental opportunities to interact with that information in order to be able to master it, to achieve proficiency. So they need repetition. They need it taught to them a completely different way, taught again. Sometimes they need someone to teach it to them before they interact with it. And those are called pre-teaching and reteaching. Sometimes they need it, like I said, they need it provided completely different. So, like I said about the continuum, what each student needs is different. But to answer your question, Board Member Cummins, I'm going to just take a statistic. So a majority of students would be able to make progress with that information if before the teacher, the core instruction teacher, the content expert, the general educator taught that student and the other 29 or however many students in his or her class, provided an outline to the student, provided some visual graphics, provided the vocabulary, so that the special education teacher or a paraprofessional who's trained by the special education teacher, or that general education teacher who had been trained by the special educator, provided those pre-teaching interactions for that student within the general education classroom. Any of those three people could come into, or the general educator would already be there, could come into the classroom, provide that information to the student before the content, and then the general educator provides the content. And then after the content is provided, that special educator could come back. A paraprofessional trained by the special educator could come back. That general educator who's been trained by the special educator could then use formative assessment to determine if that student has mastered that content, and if not, what the gaps are, and re-teach, possibly in a completely different manner, possibly just providing other methodology, possibly providing just opportunities for repetition. The special educator, the paraprofessional, the general educator could do that same thing with small groups of students. So not just the one of the 30, but 3 or 4. So that type of structure is what people generally think about push in. The same type of thing could be accomplished if before the lesson is taught or after the lesson is taught, the student with the disability and other students with disabilities who have similar gaps in their mastery of the content were pulled out of the class to receive the pre-teaching, to receive reteaching, to interact with that content in a different way or with more repetitions. So there, hopefully that starts to answer your question. Another way that that information could be provided is what's come up several times already today in a co-teaching setting where those 30 students have 2 teachers, general education content expert and a special education specially designed instruction expert. So they co-plan the lesson and think through ahead of time. Where are students with disabilities or students who are learning English, students who struggle with this kind of content, because we're all on a continuum, we all have strengths and weaknesses. Where is this content going to catch up? Students with a disability, where are they going to have a hard time? Where are they going to get stuck? What vocabulary don't they know that we have to plan for? And then the 2 teachers together can plan instruction that responds to the needs of the students in the class who probably aren't going to struggle and the students in the class who are going to struggle. So that's another way that the students can get that type of instruction right there in a general education setting. Does that help to answer that question?
Yes, may I follow up, Chair?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. That is very helpful. Is it part of the IEP for a parent to have input on whether their child is push in, pull out in a co-teaching classroom?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are 4 parts to an IEP. Part 3 is the services section. And in the services section, the IEP team working together determines what type of service the student needs, like say reading instruction, and then how much of that service the student needs. So let's say 30 minutes a day, and then where that instruction would be provided, if it's going to be provided in the regular class, in a special class, if that service can be provided and this is the point at which the consideration of the least restrictive environment comes in. The law requires that if that service can be provided in a setting with the student's non-disabled peers, then it should be. But if that service requires that the student be removed from non-disabled peers, then the team would determine how far away from those non-disabled peers that service would need to be provided, like a special ed class, or possibly a special school, which is a completely separate building. possibly the student's disability is so intense that that service would need to be provided in a hospital or possibly at the student's home. So yes, that there is a specific place on the IEP in which the team, including the parents, makes those determinations.
And sorry, last question. So I'm trying to get this information and then connect it to these rules. So here's my connecting question. Then is, do you feel like we have enough resources in our state financially and enough teachers to do a really good job at these models that you've described in the least restrictive environment for students?
Oh, that's such a great question. So we have a teacher shortage. We have a general teacher shortage, and we have a shortage of special education teachers. Utah has a long history of allowing paraprofessionals to provide specially designed instruction if they are trained and supervised by special education professionals, which means a special ed teacher or a speech language pathologist or a school psychologist, whoever the provider of that, the licensed provider of that service would be. Other states do not actually allow that. So no, we don't have enough teachers. I mean, if we had more special education teachers, we could certainly provide more services. Of course, that would be considerably more expensive, which our state also doesn't have tons more money for increasing the number of teachers, much less what they're paid so that they want to come do this work. But we have accommodated as a state for that in several different ways. One is to allow professionals who are trained and supervised to provide that service. Another is to create endorsements so that individuals who have licenses in other areas can actually help provide services and supports to students with disabilities. You as a board have approved 2 such endorsements, a speech language technician who provides some of the services and supports that a speech language pathologist can, and that is a licensed position, an individual with a bachelor's degree who gets extra training to get that endorsement. And then similarly, the special education eligibility evaluator, that's another license. It's an endorsement, so it attaches to the license of an educator who gets extra training to be able to provide services and supports to special ed students. But otherwise, I think districts and charter schools are doing creative and useful, helpful work to support students with disabilities, and we have outcome data to show that when IEP teams really work to determine what a student needs, and then the LEA really works to provide that service to the student, that students make progress.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's all the questions I had.
Thank you, Member Cummins. Member Haynes has a question.
Okay, there, I turned the video on. Yeah, so I have a couple questions, Chair Lear, if I could ask Leah maybe for some insight and help on a couple of these. One is related to, let's see, on page 259, if Ben could go to that page. It's right at the beginning of X.U. that talks about the documentation for services. And by the way, I love this discussion. We've made a lot of progress, and I'm very happy with our success and the value that will provide. But and kind of in the intent of being more helpful, I want to know why. I've spoke with a couple LEAs and concerned about the state mirroring some of these federal requirements so at the very bottom of 259, I just wanted to know why we are looking to add that federal requirement for the state special education funds. And then the other question, and maybe I'll just ask it now as well, is related to the carry forward funds. And I know that we've discussed this in the past, but as I've talked with a couple LEAs, the thought was, wouldn't it be nice if we could be, get a little bit more warning than a 1 year warning, maybe similar to the land trust funds, where if a carry forward balance exists in excess of what is needed or allotted, that they could have 2 or 3 years to adjust that. And like I said, I know we've already talked about that, but I'd like to maybe hear a little bit more clarification on that if I could. Does that make sense? Is that a good question for Leah?
Probably.
Okay.
Leah, is that good for you, or with Scott Jones' help?
So, Chair Lear, how about if I answer the second question first, and then I think it would be best if we actually turn the first question over to Neil Stevens and Cole Shakespeare, the fiscal specialists.
If we ever get there. Okay. Yes,
so the second question, so when we brought the carry forward rule 742 to the committee a couple of months ago, I requested that LEAs be given the year, which the finance committee approved, but that's really your decision.
Okay.
So I think you as a board could make that decision. So.
Okay.
And then I think Neil and Cole would be best to answer the first question.
Let me interrupt you for a second, and because I'm not sure what all of the pronouns meant. So and I think you meant R277-525, right?
Yeah. Sorry, did I say something different?
Or 42, but that's all right. I thought I knew what you meant. And then
sorry.
It would be the board's decision if the board wanted to delay that. Is that what you were trying to make it? Give them a 2 years notice or a 5 years notice or something? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, because yes, that is exactly what I'm saying, because it is your rule. It's your rule that has been on the books forever that LEAs return the funds, which they haven't been doing. So you could make that determination.
And just to give us full understanding, to the extent we can. And sorry, Mike, I'm not trying to.
No, that's okay.
Question or hijack it, but is there anything that is compelling in terms of giving the LEAs 2 more years or more years?
I think the thing that is compelling is that we keep hearing from the legislative fiscal analyst that he has serious concerns about these carry forward funds. And I think if you want someone to speak more to that, Deputy Superintendent Jones would be a better person, but we have been talking about these particular funds for 2 years now. Terry Shoemaker came to a meeting with me a year and a half, almost 2 years now, to talk to special ed directors about these carry forward funds. And some of them have really took that to heart and really started working to spend down those funds starting 2 years ago when we started this conversation. So.
Do you know, if I can ask, if there is a similar carry forward structure with the land trust funds? Is there a kind of a warning period and a remedy period that exists with the land trust funds?
I couldn't respond to that. Deputy Jones would be a better person to respond.
Okay. Yeah, I just think that gives an LEA a little bit more time for proper planning, especially with the changes that we're seeing in a high growth state. And you never know. So
as it relates, Chair, if I may, is Scott Jones, Deputy Superintendent of Ops. Can I answer his question, Chair? Oh, okay.
She's muted.
Just go ahead, Scott. I will give you.
Okay, so just real quick, just to Board Member Haynes' question is, yes, I mean, there's a process that we use. So if a school doesn't, spend their land trust money, and we discover that through the monitoring process or follow-up process, we always give them a chance to, get that right. I think that's what you're asking, right?
Right.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Okay.
And is that a 2-year or 3-year warning and remedy period?
Yeah, that I'd have to check. It's, I'm pretty sure it's 1 year, just to say, hey, look, you have these balances. There's been a lot of discussion in TAC about, the ability to move money between schools within a district, things like that. There's been all those kinds of discussions. My experience with it is they usually give them a year to do it and then come back, right, as a follow-up to it. But I'll double check with Paula real quick. So.
Thank you. Mike, did you have more to ask about that, or is that enough info?
Yeah, I guess I would just like a little bit more clarity on what we can recommend, and I guess what that looks like. So can we say 3 years, or is there anything that needs to be changed to account for that?
You want an answer right now, or would you like to, are you a suggestion or an answer from Scott, or do you want to?
Just curious what would be required to make a change like that?
Yeah. Chair Lear, may I speak?
Please do.
This is Angie Stallings. First of all, the requirements we're talking about are in another rule that is not on our agenda today, which is R277-525. So we would want to bring the rule either back to law and licensing, or it did go through finance before. That doesn't mean it needs to go back to finance, or it could go to the full board. So that would be the first item, is to have the rule set for an agenda for a committee or the full board to take action. And then second, while you were speaking and Deputy Superintendent Jones was responding, I just quickly looked at R277-477, which is the School Land Trust Program rule. That rule requires an LEA that has carry forward 10% or more. In that instance, it's not 20, but it's 10%, that they are required to provide an explanation for any carry forward that exceeds that 10%. And if they have that carry forward, it just says multiple years. It doesn't explain if it's 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, but that they be placed on corrective action. And then based on the corrective action, the money can be taken away. So the language is a little different, whereas it doesn't say the superintendent shall or the LEA shall return the funds like 752. They have a little bit different process. So I just wanted to raise that. It doesn't give an explicit number of years, other than it does require the very first year that there's carry forward for them to provide an explanation to, I guess, USBE.
Okay. Again, the intent for this is just to give the LEAs a little bit more flexibility if there is in excess of that carry forward balance.
Yeah. And so Angie and I, great minds think alike. So I was checking too, if they carry over greater than 20% for more than 2 years, the superintendent can take corrective action. So I think, as a general business practice, something when we discover that they have these balances, we ask them to explain it. Well, when, to Angie's point, when they're over 10%, and then we say, okay, you got to get them down, or, if it's greater than 20%, then I'm sure we approach the superintendent and say, okay, we've got a situation here. So.
Did you, Member Haynes, do you have more follow-up, or is that
on that carry forward? No, I think I've got a better understanding about that, but back related to X.U documentation for
one. Right. Paul, do you want to speak to that?
Well, my biggest concern is anytime we use federal guidelines as an example to follow, it makes the hair on my back of my neck stand up, right? So just if you could explain that and why that's important and why it would be included in this.
Cole?
Board Member Lear, I don't know if maybe Assistant Superintendent Voorhees or I'd be happy to also explain why I think the feedback that we received. Leah, would you like me to say something, or would you like to say something?
Yeah, I'm fine to respond. I just thought that Cole and Neil, being auditors, would really be able to share.
Sorry, then maybe they're best. Sorry, Leah.
No, that's okay. But so I can just go ahead.
Okay.
So in the last couple of years, in the monitoring that we have done, the majority of the findings of noncompliance have been related to the fact that LEAs don't have clear and black and white standards for the allowable use of state special education dollars. So this documentation request, and then subsequently further down in the rules, the table that demonstrates what monitoring would look like, are an attempt to create very clear standards for not only the allowable use of the funds, but how LEAs can demonstrate that they did use the funds allowably, so that we at the State Board of Education, in the Special Education Department, the LEAs and auditors all have the same standard that we can all reference for the allowable use of funds. The reason that the federal standards are used is because there isn't a state standard, and our auditing department, our internal audit section, as well as, it is my understanding, the legislative and office of auditors, in the absence of a state standard, refer back to the federal standard. And Deputy Superintendent Jones can correct me if I said that incorrectly, or Debbie Davis, our internal audit executive, if she's on, if she's in the meeting as well. But so the question, I think the answer to the question is two-part. So we need a standard in order for all of us to be able to be on the same page, and for LEAs to be able to understand what is allowable and what isn't allowable. And we have a federal standard. We have not had a state standard. So therefore, we are recommending adopting the federal standard so that there is one, first of all. Two, it's simplified because it's consistent. So LEAs can then, and we in our office can apply the allowable use back and forth. In most cases, they're not identical. There are some things in state statute that are different inherently than the federal. So I hope that's a little bit helpful.
Okay. I don't know if I'm unique in this, but I don't think so. But I would think others feel that the federal requirements would be more restrictive, and that might not be received well by the LEAs. And I would hate to have to build more resources, add more FTE to monitor that if those requirements are broader than what could have been created by a state requirement. But I understand where you're coming from. I'd love to hear what anybody else has to say on that, and if they feel that to be a concern, or maybe I'm way out in left field.
By someone else, Member Haynes, another committee member or another staff member.
Chair Lear, can I speak, please? This is Neil Stevens.
Oh, Neil is on.
Yes, go ahead, please, Neil.
Speaking from our experience in monitoring schools, we've monitored probably in excess of 30 schools over the past 2.5 years. The documentations, or lack of documentation for use of state funds has been problematic when we do these monitoring visits. Is when we ask for documentation of how this money was spent or whom was spent on, that was actually went to the services delivered to special education students. Oftentimes there is very little documentation or none at all. Some of the larger, more problematic monitoring results that required large amounts of money to be paid back have been a direct result of this, where there is no documentation that that person provided any special ed services, or that this items purchased were for special education uses.
Right.
And so this is an effort to put guardrails or a framework around this so LEAs can know what documentation to have or to maintain in the event of a monitoring visit, not just by USBE, but the federal government also does monitoring and would apply the similar standard to the federal use of funds. Also, currently, the Office of the State Auditor is conducting a audit of use of special ed funds, and they're approaching LEAs and requesting the same information. So this is an effort to put guardrails on the issue and also to provide LEAs with an idea of what is expected. And if they have an idea of what's expected and what they need to have available, this will reduce the findings in the future of non-compliance for use of special education funds. Regarding your point, board member, about the concern that the federal requirement may be overly burdensome, I can appreciate that, and oftentimes the federal requirement is very burdensome. However, back in December of 2012, the federal requirements for documentation, especially for personal services, was greatly reduced. And it simply says it has to be supported by a system of internal controls. So, and that is a very broad statement. It gives them a lot of leeway. And the system of internal controls is an accounting principle of how you control all the financial recording, documentation, expenditures throughout your system. And in theory, in best accounting practices, LEAs should not be reporting expenditures to any funds, much less restricted funds, without proper documentation, backup documentation, invoices. So we're just trying to help LEAs really become more compliant and more like a business in the sense of following proper accounting rules. Because what we don't want is to be in a situation where LEAs have large amounts of expenditures and they can't document that were spent properly.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Mike, do you have another follow-up or?
No, I'll leave it. I'll send it back to you. Thank you, Chair.
Right. Board Member Davis next. Member Davis.
Thank you. I first, just in general on these rules, want to thank Dr. Voorhees and her team. I think they have gone just back and forth, probably ad nauseum, with so many different stakeholders trying to get this right. And I appreciate her patience and her work and the work of the team in general for all of the rules. In respect to the issue that Board Member Haynes raised, would it be possible, since I do understand that we have the rule that we passed in May, but I believe that the carry forward structure came originally from these rules that we're kind of re-upping today, would it be possible for him to make a motion to give that year that Dr. Voorhees had suggested LEAs have to prep up for this? I'm not sure. I guess maybe Dr. Voorhees can help us clarify. I guess that didn't get into the other board rule, R277-525, I think it is. So I just want to also go a little bit back on a timeline so I can understand where we're really looking. This rule, the 20% carry forward reclamation opportunity, has been on our books for many years, is what I'm understanding. I have completely misunderstood this until 4 hours ago, and I've been studying this for the last 4 hours, trying to wrap my head around it. So that's been on the books for many years. And then this year, or 2 years ago, we started telling special ed directors that this was going to change. And I'm wondering and based on suggestions from the LFA. I'm wondering if the message got from the special ed directors to all of the admin teams or only some of those, because it seems like a correspondence we've had from a charter representative. And then I reached out to a BA this morning. He didn't reach out to me. I reached out to him and I said, hey, is this all good? And he's like, it really isn't. and he felt like it was a new rule. So when I look back and try to figure out where the communication was, I called Terry Shoemaker prior to this meeting. He said he did know a couple of years ago that in a meeting, which must be the director's meeting that Dr. Voorhees is mentioning, that this could be coming down the pike. But he said, we've never talked about it in our superintendent's meetings, or he said, I've also never talked about it with business administrators in the BA meetings. So maybe someone else has, and that I am trying to figure out. I have been able to find one thing, and that was a letter that our finance folks, Cole, I think, sent out on June 8th, a month ago, to BA saying we're going to take this money back. But I just think some of them may have been surprised because there are 58 LEAs who are losing this carry forward money. And I know people are going to say it is an Alpine issue. It can't be just an Alpine issue because 42 LEAs actually have a greater percentage of carryover than Alpine does. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around kind of the same question that Mike Haynes has. Did folks have enough time? And while we were giving the information out, did their counterparts get the information back to the admin teams? And if not, did we send it out? And where is it? Do we have that to kind of go back on? Or do we need to say we need to spend another year or 2 or 3 ramping up to the implementation of this rule that's been on our books for years? And if we do, will that put us in a problematic situation because we just voted in May to use that money to pay for the intensive services funds? So then will we have no money for that? There are a lot of questions and comments mixed into that. I'm wondering if someone could help me to understand if Board Member Haynes could do what he is suggesting and ask for a however many years push out on this part of section that talks about the reclamation. But if he does do that, what are the pros and the cons? Can someone help us with that? And can that be done here, or can that only be done in 752?
And I would think Angie might be the best person to speak to that. Angie, can you speak to that question from Cindy?
Sure. So I can speak to not about the communication with LEAs about the requirements. I think that Leah and Scott would probably be better to speak to that. But as to your question about what action can be taken today to either add a year or a couple years or remove the 20% carry forward limit, we actually need to take action on the rule R277-525 and would need to have that put on an agenda. If there's something in the special ed manual that incorporates by reference 752, that's what I'm guessing it does. It would not trump. I think that the special ed manual simply repeats or restates the standard that has been set in 752. So if you could point me to the language, though, that you're specifically concerned about, I could maybe see what a motion might look like today. But my guess is that you'd actually need to have the rule be on our agenda and that we'd need to take action on that rule as opposed to any language in the SPED manual that might be restating the standard in R277-752. So it looks like we've got a 202, page 202 in.
And it's XP, capital X, capital P.
Okay. So I see that, and I've read that. That language, it wouldn't take care of the language in 752. So if you were to make a motion to strike this language, you would still have R277-752 that is binding separately, if that makes sense. So we need to take action on the actual rule.
Cindy, do you want to ask further or speak to that?
Yeah, so the question is, Angie, could there be like a grandfather clause or something put into the language in this rule that particular reclamation piece will begin in however many years board member Haynes thinks is appropriate, and then whatever changes need to be made in the other one could be made? And also, then what unintended consequences does that bring?
Well, and just to make sure I understand what you're asking, Cindy, are you asking maybe a variation on what Angie just said? Is there anything that can be done to this provision in the rule that would trump or counteract R277-525-752? Is that what you're asking, Cindy?
I don't know that it would trump it. I mean, the other one would probably have to be changed after this is changed, but this at least I would think would start the process if there was something put in there saying it would be implemented. I'm wondering why if Dr. Voorhees suggested that they have a year, was that on this May rule? Why didn't we put that year into motion?
I don't know.
The committee, can I respond, Chair?
Yes, please.
So in the committee discussion, they did think it was a good idea, but they didn't include it in the motion. They passed the rule with the current language, but they did think it was a good idea. And so we went forward with putting the year of planning into practice.
Is that, Cindy?
And may I ask a question? Because that might help me. Because I was looking in the rule and I did not see a 1-year reference, so that might make sense. So, Leah, what I think you're telling me is that the rule would require you to do that immediately, but you kind of agreed by motion to kind of give them a year to get into compliance. Is that what I'm hearing?
Correct, because that is how I presented it to the committee, that I thought it was in the best interests of the LEAs that they had a year to figure it out. Because one of the very valid questions that we received feedback about was where did these balances come from? Why do they continue? So we had the discussion that if we gave the LEAs a year to figure out where it came from, to spend it down or send it back, that was a more fair, I don't know if those are the right words, but that gave them the opportunity to do some investigating and some planning.
So when was that year to start, Leah?
So July 1 through June 30 of next year, so last week.
Oh, so it was to start July 2020 to June 2021.
Correct.
Thank you. Cindy, do you have?
Yeah, thanks. So are we talking about the finance committee? They chose not to put it in and then we went through and passed it. And I'll be honest, I did not fully understand this when we passed it in May, but it seems like a year for them to have a very kind of formal written understanding is really different than a letter in June, so of 1 month ago. So I'm just wondering, what can we do now right here in this document to make a difference? And if we do it, will we be able to get funds from the legislature to pay for intensive services after we've already said we're going to use these funds to pay for intensive services?
I think that's an Angie question. Sorry, it's a hard one.
I'm trying to understand the question. So, and let me help, because I was not in the finance committee meeting when they discussed this rule, R277-752. So I apologize. I'm kind of coming up to speed on this issue as you are. Leah, explain to me. So the year is, we've got, I don't remember, somebody said 50 LEAs who have more than 20% carry forward. And so now the practice is that from July 1 of 2020 to June 30 of 2021, you're going to allow them to spend that or make a spend plan for that in lieu of doing what the rule states, which would have been on July 1, requiring that excess funds to have been given back, right, on July 1 of 2020. Is that what would have happened, but for the year?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is so the letter that Board Member Davis is referencing is the notice of the year to the year starting last week. So this fiscal year that we are now in to do that spend plan and or decide that they can't spend the money and send it back.
And you all took that direction based on a motion from the Finance Committee who supported that year, it sounds like. And so now it sounds to me like board members Davis and Haynes would like to give additional time. So, and because it wasn't in the rule and it was a motion of a committee, it sounds like it's something that we could change. However, number one, I would feel more comfortable, first of all, if the rule were on the agenda. It's not on the agenda. Number two, it might make sense to actually, because there seems to be so much concern about it from LEAs, it may make sense to bring the rule to either here, Finance Committee, or the board to actually codify that 1 year allowance, kind of like what we do sometimes where we say for this school year, we're going to allow this or whatever. So because it might make more sense so that staff doesn't feel caught in between two different committees and their will, so to speak, if we actually bring the rule back or have an official motion from the full board statement. And I'd be happy to help prepare that, either prepare the rule for the full board or to bring the rule back. It sounds like there's no action that's going to happen between now and our August law and licensing committee meeting, because they do have a year to spend it, except for that maybe there are LEAs that are budgeting right now, and that might change how they budget. So I'm just throwing that out as some possibilities of what we could do to solve or make it very clear what the expectation is.
Chair, can I follow up one thing with Angie?
Yes, please.
Angie, I guess my understanding is that they did not take Dr. Voorhees' suggestion of putting in a year, and that it was immediately going to go into practice. So what Board Member Haynes is suggesting, and all of you correct me if I'm not understanding what you're saying, is that there be time given, a heads up time of 1, 2, 3 years, whatever, rather than immediately going into practice. But what I'm hearing you say, Angie, is that you think they did put a 1 year. This isn't going to happen for 1 year from now, from May, when we did the rule. Could you clarify that? And then also, if someone could answer the question about how will we pay for intensive services if we don't reclaim these funds?
Angie, please.
Actually, I still don't think I'm the best person because I wasn't in the Finance Committee. I think I understood that the committee did say it's okay and they do have a year. Leah, could you help me? Correct me?
That was my understanding.
So they still have a year. We didn't ask them to give the money back on July 1. So,
right.
Okay.
So we have not asked them to give the money back. We have asked them to give us a spend plan for which they have a year we asked them to give us a spend plan in August, and then they have the year to implement the spend plan. So by August, they would have 11 months to implement the spend plan. And
unless the rule was changed, I'm presuming.
Unless the rule is changed.
Right.
Or unless you give me different direction.
Okay. And then
I agree with Angie, needs to come through rule.
And in the second part of the question, how do we pay for intensive services? Angie, Scott, I'm not sure who should answer that.
I can quickly answer. So we budget for about $4 million of intensive services funds every year. Some of it is state and some of it is federal. The money that would come back from the carry forward would be added to that. So it would be additional intensive services funds. So we haven't to this point ever sent out as much intensive services funds as LEAs have actually requested. So when the $4 million is gone, it's gone. And everybody else who's on the list doesn't get any. So the money that we would take back from LEAs would allow us to fund further down the list of requests. Does that help answer the question?
It's helpful to me. Cindy?
Yes, it does. So when I look at this spreadsheet of these 58 LEAs who would be giving this certain amount of percentage on top of the 20% of carryover, is the spend plan, for example, for the 20% plus any excess, or is the spend plan for the excess of the 20%?
The excess of the 20%.
Is there one single financial implication for any LEA that's happening this year? Because we're hearing that some of these, because this impacts WPU, it could impact other voted leeway and different types of things. Do we have an understanding of, even if I give you a carry forward plan by, for next year, I'm going to still have these financial implications? Do we have that information anywhere?
Angie, Scott?
I am not aware of any individual LEA. I have not discussed impacts on their budgets. I apologize.
So you don't know. Scott, do you have any idea?
I have not had, other than one district recently that I talked to an accountant in that district. I haven't heard back from any business administrators or LEAs specifically on how it impacts their budget. Just one.
Chair Lear, this is Neil Stevens.
Yes, please go ahead. I was just trying to get those words out. Thank you.
No, that's fine. I have been one of the primary staff working on this project, calculation, reviewing balances, and so forth. This has been a project of the legislative fiscal analysis for quite some time. Von Horton, who was a former USB employee, who's now left. Historically, these balances at LEAs have been increasing over time. They're not decreasing. So in our view, the LEAs aren't utilizing these balances to be drawn down significantly. And so the impacts of the spending on operations, most LEAs appear to be negligible in our view, if these balances are increasing from year to year. Right now, as of fiscal 19, the end of fiscal 19, the carry forward amounts in special education for state funds across all LEAs was approximately $50 million. 2 years ago, that number was in the low $40 million. I can't remember the exact amount, but it was much less. So these balances have been going up. Why they're going up and why not being used, I haven't made that analysis yet. I haven't spoken with individual LEAs to that extent. But based on feedback received in our last training with administrators, I believe a lot of the intent for keeping these funds is for cash days on hand for bond purposes. Some bond companies are pretty restrictive about using prior year revenue that wasn't spent in the following year. So there are financial implications, but I'm not sure that it's fully understood on each individual LEA, and each LEA is going to have a different set of consequences for returning these funds to the SEA, in this case, USBE. I don't think there's a uniform consequence or uniform concerns that we can apply to all 160 plus LEAs we have.
Plus, taking the prerogative, I'd like to hear that. I'd like to hear those consequences objectively provided, in addition to hearing subjective information from LEAs. But I think it's a really valid question.
So I've started that process.
Pardon? One more time? again, Neil?
His audio may have cut out, or
Okay.
maybe he doesn't realize. Neil, can you hear us? We can't hear you. It sounds like he is not, his audio must have been cut out, but it sounds like he might have additional information on this topic if we do bring back 752 to the committee or to a board meeting.
Okay. Can I suggest, in order to hear from everyone, can we, Cindy, Member Haynes, can you just ponder for a minute what you want to do about the issue of section X P for today, and then, but can we hear from the rest of other individuals to see if that's the only concern, if we can remove that and discuss moving the rest of the rules along. So is that okay, Cindy?
Certainly.
Not
Yes.
not sidelining it. Just hold that thought for a minute, and I'll go to Member Thorpe.
I just wanted to express that I think well, in an effort to move things along, I would like to make a motion. If Brittany has something that she wants to speak to before that.
That's helpful. Brittany, is there something you'd like to speak to before Laurie ends?
Yeah, I just had a couple of points on this topic really quick. Just in full disclosure, I am board chair at Endeavor Hall, which is one of the schools that has an amount of money that we're working on paying down. But one of the things, and so maybe just speaking from that point of view, we have been trying to pay it down for a couple of years. And one of the things that we run into is in the federal guidelines, you have to maintain a certain maintenance of effort. And so from year to year, you can't have this huge spending spree and then not have a maintenance of effort issue the next year, as far as I understand it. And so the pay down plan that Endeavor Hall engaged in was over several years' time. And then, trying to get that balance down, not trying to maintain the funds for cash hand or anything like that. It was just, how do we reasonably spend this in a way where we don't harm ourselves in the process as far as other regulations? And so I don't know if there's, and if that's a misunderstanding and we can just go and spend it down really quickly. But I think it's just making sure that we recognize that LEAs are engaging in this process, but you can't just go out and spend it all really quickly like a land trust thing. You could buy a project or do something big for your school.
There's an MOE concern. And another, Lorianne, do you mind if Brittany adds any, did you have another?
No, go ahead.
No, that was just my thought of just making sure that and recognizing the time needed to spend it down is probably more than a year as schools look at, unless I've totally misunderstood the maintenance of effort regulations on the federal side.
Thank you for introducing that concern, because I had heard that from a number of other emails I've received. So Lorianne, do you want to go back to your motion now, or your comment?
You've got a handful of days too.
I know. Cindy, do you want to hear Lorianne's motion first, or do you want to comment in addition about the same issue?
I'd like to speak first, if that's okay with you.
Lorianne,
Sure.
Okay,
Yes. I want to make it clear that I'm in support of all of this, but want to find out if there's a way to also support what Member Haynes has brought up. I agree that we cannot have carry forward balances that get bigger and bigger every year. We have to do something to rein that in. But having said that, there's a big picture involved here, right? Because it's kind of messy. There's like a 2-year lag with special education funding. There's we have intensive services needs, and if you're too far down the list, you don't get funded because there's not enough, but yet my little neighbor down the street who's on a feeding tube still gets to go to school every day and get nurse support, even though there's no funding coming in to pay for it. There's this ridiculous legislative cap that says if your district is a certain size, you can't have any more than 12% kids with disabilities. Who gets to decide that? We still have to give an IEP and provide the services, and yet the extra funds don't come for those. And so I think we have to just be so careful and not say that maybe there's not a need for all this money. I don't think that's the case at all. I think you've got people out there with all of these different rules and regulations and caps and limits, and they're trying to be as smart as they can to make sure that their tails are going to be covered every stinking year. I think that's where we are with this, and does it need to change? Yes, and maybe some more pieces can change than just this to make it less enticing to try to carry over funds to make sure you're always covered. Right. I think the bigger issue, honestly, is just the communication piece and giving charters and districts time to round up, to take care of these things. I just got a text from someone on the state charter board who said, if the information was given to the SPED directors, it didn't get back to the charter directors, nor did it get back to the BAs also. So I think that maybe we could create something to help our special ed directors get that information back to the admin teams, or we could communicate with the admin teams, or we could do something. So I totally agree that we can't have these carry forward balances going. But I think that if there's anything in this meeting we could do today to extend this time, or at least postpone this one section to come back, then we could maybe try to iron out some of this stuff, and we could get the information requested by you, Chair Lear, as to what the exact impacts and financial implications are for LEAs if this rolls forward as written.
Thank you. Good points all. Anything
Board
else?
Member Lear?
Yes.
I do have an idea that might work to get the rule moving forward. Is maybe we could change the section XP to say state special education funds. So this isn't, Leah, I might need your help. Is this just about intensive services? It looks like it is. So could we just say state special education funds allocated but unspent must be carried and returned in accordance with R277-525 or something broader like that. And then that would give the opportunity to then look at 752 later. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a way that...
Yeah, so this is Leah. Sorry, Chair Lear, can I respond?
Please, yes.
Yeah, so you asked previously if anywhere in these rules we incorporated by reference the 752. Well, it's right up above, but otherwise, yes, I think that would be a simple way to move forward today, is to just change that language in XP.
And so, but we would also then have to change it right above, on the line above that Leah just referenced. Is that not so, Angie, or no?
No, I think the line above is okay, actually.
Okay. That, I understanding, I think one of Cindy's concerns was that doesn't change anything in 752 today, but I think we now understand that there's nothing happening to LEAs for a year. So does that allay your fears of, or desire to do something today to change 752? Cindy?
I would feel more comfortable to do what Board Member Haynes is suggesting, and instead of referencing all that stuff and trying to go back and change again in 752, just put an implementation date on the 20% recapture in this rule.
Would that be contrary, Angie? Would that be contrary to 752?
I mean, I feel very uncomfortable with that because it really is about 752. I think the action needs to be in our set 277-752, because now you would be setting yourself up to having the manual, which is incorporated by reference in 750, being contrary. I'm just trying to think through this. And the other thing to remember is that this manual will then go to the board. It'll go through a 30-day comment period. It won't take effect for a couple of months, even if you were to do something in this manual today. So that is why my preference would be for R277-525 itself to be put on a board agenda if it's urgent, next week or in 2 weeks. And because this is going to be a number of months out, and it just creates a potential conflict between two rules and two committees that took two different actions.
And I guess my feeling, if I can interject, my feeling about that concern is because we did recently, I received an email from Scott where this was discussed in the legislature last February. I want to call attention to a contradiction between our manual and our rule. Because I think the legislature bears some responsibility for moving this in this direction. So that's another concern I have.
Chair?
Think about that. Yes.
Is it possible to pass this just without this section, or will that cause another can of worms? The legislative session last February, the discussion was specific to Representative Judkin's bill, which was trying to fix that cap that was limiting special education numbers. And a senator did bring up that there were carry forward funds. So they are concerned that there are carry forward funds. I think everybody understands that that is something that needs to be mitigated. But what is the right time frame to mitigate it is the question here. And can we do something in this rule to mitigate it? And if we don't do it here, is it going to be problematic because we're going to say, oh, well, now it's not on an agenda and now we've got to do something else, and you know how it goes.
Yeah, but I did hear Angie say that we could delete this section in this rule, pass the rule if the committee is so inclined, and then address the problem in the problem of 752 in the next possible board meeting, understanding that this rule has no immediate effective date, and that 752 is already being delayed by administrative action for a year. So we do have a little bit of wiggle room. Does that suit you, Member Davis, or not?
I think it will be okay. I may not be in that next meeting for some reasons, but I just think we have to look at the timeline. I think this is important. I can see there are reasons that it needs to happen, but I can also see there are reasons that the carry forward is happening anyway. And I think all of it needs to be looked at holistically and addressed. And I think we need a black and white understanding of what is happening with special education funds in the charters and districts right now. How much money are they losing or getting? How much down the list are we able to give for intensive services funds? You know, how does that impact kids where the rubber meets the road? So I think it's fine if we take that out for this part, if there are no unintended consequences that Dr. Voorhees sees.
Do you want to respond to that, Dr. Voorhees, or are you okay, feel like you've said that?
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
Okay.
I mean,
go ahead.
We haven't been applying it all of these years when we should have. So not applying it for one more year just seems like continuing our current course.
Okay. Thank you. Laurie Ann, let's come back to you, and you've been very patient.
Thanks, Chair Lear. I guess just in general, I do have some concerns about delaying this. I think more clarification helps, and I think that it's a service to LEAs to have that clarification. I also support having flexibility, especially as the maintenance of effort issue has come up, but I do think that that's a different discussion for a different rule. Angie, I heard you on your suggested language. But since I didn't write it down exactly, what I'm going to do, if it's okay, I'll make the motion, and then if we want to have an amendment or something like that, is that the way we should go about this? Because
That makes sense.
okay, so I move that the committee approve R277-750 draft 1 on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading.
But leaving that section in or deleting that section, Lorianne?
So my motion is to go ahead with it the way it is. If someone else would like to make an amendment, then.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to call attention to that, but thank you. I appreciate that. So the motion is or I should say, is there a discussion to that motion? Member Cummins.
Yeah, I'd like to make an amendment to the motion on the special ed rules to remove section X.P.
Okay, so the amendment, I think, is in order. That the rules would, the motion is to pass the rule as written, and that includes the manual, with the deletion of section XP. So that's the currently amended motion. Any discussion to that amendment? I see no hands. So let's vote on the amendment. To repeat it, the amendment is to pass the, yes, the amended motion is to pass the, R277-750, which includes the incorporation by reference of the special education manual as revised in 2020, with the deletion of section XP. Did I say that right for all of you scholars that are listening?
Chair?
Yes.
Just a technical thing. Sorry, Ben Rasmussen just put in the
chat.
Is this the original or A, which includes some of the added words? And then also, just do we need to pass the amendment before we get back to the main motion?
You're right about that. You're right on both counts. So yes, the amendment is to delete section XP from the manual, which would be incorporated by reference into R277-750. Any discussion to that amendment to the motion? Okay, I don't see any further discussion. So let's vote on that. Wonder if I've said something wrong. Just a minute, hang on.
Board Member Lear, did you mention that the motion is to amend version 062520A?
No.
Okay, so maybe the motion could be, the motion is to amend the Utah SPED Rules Proposed Manual 062520A with section XP being deleted, something like that.
Perfect motion. I won't try to repeat that. That is the motion. Any further discussion to that motion? I don't see any further discussion. So let's vote. Member Cummins.
Aye.
Member Thorpe.
Aye.
Member Davis.
Aye.
Member Haynes.
Aye.
And I also vote aye. So that's a unanimous vote to amend the motion. So now the motion before us is to pass R277-750. I don't even have in front of me the
Draft one.
Draft one.
Incorporating SPED Manual's proposed version 062520A.
Thank you. And that is the motion to now pass the manual.
As amended.
clarify that exemption. And you added what, Ben?
As amended.
As amended, because there was an amendment to that draft.
As amended. So now, any discussion to that motion?
And you should just add on first reading and forward to the board for approval on second and final reading. Sorry.
I think Lori Ann may have said that in her motion initially. And I should say that as amended and on first reading and for the board to consider on second reading and final reading. So with that, let's vote unless there's any further discussion. I see no hands. So Member Thorpe.
Aye.
Member Cummins.
Aye.
Member Davis.
Aye.
Member Haynes.
Aye.
And I also vote aye, and with tremendous thanks for everybody who has participated and collaborated and nice to each other. So I think that's all we have. Is there anything else I'm overlooking, Angie?
No, we've finished today's agenda.
That's the conclusion of our agenda and conclusion of this meeting. And thank you very much to everyone involved.
Thank you, Chair Lear and everyone else.